Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening the sky above. Talisa glowed with the soft hues of twin moons, casting a silvery light over the bioluminescent shores. The waves lapsed, gently leaving behind faint traces of phosphorescence that shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars at Theo's feet. He paused, breathing in the warm, slightly alien breeze, his eyes half closed as he let it wash over him. This was the quiet. He'd been searching for a break from the less chaos of his life. After months of high-stakes smuggling, ransom, legal, most less so, Tisa was his first real escape in years. Here in the tranquil isolation of the resort world, Theo could vanish into the background. No one knew his name, no one cared. He didn't have to think about cargo shipments or the pirates who had come too close to blowing his ship apart. Here, he was just another guest, anonymous and unburdened. But peace was fleeting as always. Is this seat taken? The voice was smooth, melodic, and confident, cutting through the quiet like a ripple in still water. Theo opened his eyes and turned to the source. For the briefest moment he faltered, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with what he saw before him. A woman stood there, her skin green, but not an earthy green. It was the color of freshly bloomed leaves after a rain, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Her eyes were large, golden amber, and reflective, catching the twin moons like mirrors. There was something ethereal about her, as if she'd been sculpted from starlight and shadows. No, Theo stammered, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. It's not, thank you, she replied, moving with the grace of liquid as she slipped onto the cushion next to him. The subtle scent of something floral, alien yet strangely familiar, drifted between them. For a moment, Theo felt like he had stepped into a dream. Everything about her seemed too surreal, too perfect for his mundane reality. He tried to center himself. This wasn't the time to be overwhelmed, but how could he not be? The galaxy's most famous woman supermodel, Oral Cora, had just sat down next to him. Theo barely kept up with human celebrities, much less intergalactic ones. But even he knew who she was. Not that her fame mattered to him, but the sheer improbability of this moment left him reeling. I'm Oriel, she said, her gaze never leaving his face. Theo, he replied, forcing a smile. As he gave a slight nod, he felt out of place, as though the peaceful night had just shifted into something far more complicated. It's a nice evening. It is, she tiled her head slightly, her amber eyes reflecting the moons. I enjoy this planet. It's peaceful, untouched by the usual chaos of everything. Theo nodded, his voice trailing off. Yeah, that's what I was hoping for, a break from it all. Oral's lips curved into a slight smile, mischievous but tired. I imagine your everything looks a little different from mine. Theo chuckled softly, relaxing a bit. You could say that I'm just here to disappear for a while. No obligations, no problems to solve, no galaxy-threatening emergency. He tried to keep the conversation light, though a part of him wondered why she'd chosen to speak to him of all people. A vacation from the universe, Oral teased, arching an elegant brow. I know the feeling. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the conversation turned unspoken. Theo could sense the weight she carried behind her glamorous exterior. It wasn't the carefree life of fame and fortune that people might expect. She sounded weary, like someone who had seen too much. No galaxy-threatening emergencies for me, he said, smirking. Just the usual go-runs, dodging pirates, and trying not to get blown up. Oral's smile widened, but her eyes, sharp and full of understanding, told a different story. I envy that kind of life. Sometimes. Theo raised an eyebrow. You envy smuggling cargo? I envy the freedom, she admitted, leaning back as her gaze drifted toward the rolling waves. My world is complicated. Politics, manipulation, veiled threats. Everyone pretends to be something they're not. Nothing is ever that simple. Theo leaned back, as well intrigued to himself. And what are you? Oriel was silent for a moment, her eyes still focused on the distant shore. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. I'm many things, a model, an ambassador, a negotiator, but none of that matters here. Theo wasn't sure how to respond. There was a rawness to her words that caught him off guard, a side to her that he hadn't expected to see. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to dig deeper or change the subject. So why are you here? He asked, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Oral's gaze returned to his, serious now. To disappear, just like you. Theo blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a casual encounter. She had sought him out for a reason. But why? You could have disappeared anywhere. Why here? And why me? Her amber eyes glinted with something that felt like a challenge. Maybe I'm curious about humans. The statement was simple, but the intensity in her gaze made Theo's breath catch. He laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "We not that interesting." "I disagree," she said, her smile softer now. "There's something fascinating about your kind, your adaptability, your resilience." Theo wasn't sure if she was complimenting him or humanity as a whole. But either way, it left him feeling off balance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to gather his thoughts. The hum of distant alien music from the resort added to the surreal tranquility of the night. "You're different from how I imagined you'd be," Theo admitted, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "Disappointed?" she asked, amusement coloring her tone. "No," Theo replied honestly, "just surprised." "Good." Oriel smile returned, a knowing glint in her eyes. "I hate being predictable." Before Theo could respond, a deep, resonant chime echoed across the beach, signaling the official transition from evening to night. The lights along the shoreline dimmed slightly, leaving the bioluminescence in the water to glow even brighter. Oriel rose gracefully to her feet, the fabric of her gown shimmering like liquid silver in the moonlight. "Good night, Theo," she said softly, her voice lingering in the air like a whisper on the wind. Before he could say anything, she turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the glowing night. Theo watched her go, the weight of her presence still hanging over him long after she disappeared from sight. He let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding this. Was not how he expected his quiet vacation to begin. As he sat alone under the alien moons, the sand shimmering at his feet, one thought kept stir in his mind: who the hell is Cora? And what does she want with me? 3 weeks had passed since that surreal night on Tesa's glowing shores, and Theo had almost convinced himself it had been a fleeting dream. Back in the cramped, familiar confines of his Starf Raider, the quiet resort world felt like another lifetime. Cargo runs through lawless space, the hum of engines beneath his feet, the occasional pulse of blaster fire as pirates tested their luck. This was the world he knew, the luxury of Tesa, the gentle row of its bioluminescent waves, and the mystery of Quara had faded into something distant, almost unreal. But the dream had followed him home. Theo stood in the ship's narrow kitchen, sipping a cup of synthetic coffee that tasted as lifeless as he felt the ship's eye. An outdated program he called Sylvie was running through diagnostics, her monotone voice droning through the empty halls. It was a quiet, uneventful morning, at least it had been, until his C-panel blinked to life with an urgent transmission. Theo frowned round. No one contacted him unless it was business, and he wasn't expecting any. His thumb hovered over the accept button, a cold sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. This wasn't a routine call. When he finally tapped the screen, the hologram flickered to life, and Theo's breath caught in his throat. It was Oral. She stood with her arms crossed, her usual grace intact, but her expression was tense. The casual allure she had worn that night on Tessa was gone, replaced by something heavier. Something strained, her golden eyes locked onto his unwavering. "Hello, Theo," she said, her voice softer than he remembered, tinged with a note of urgency. Theo blinked, struggling to find words. "Oriel, what are you doing here?" The last time he'd seen her, she had vanished into the glowing night, without a trace, leaving him to wonder if he'd ever see her again. Now here she was, standing in his ship's holographic common, a galaxy away. "We need to talk," Oriel said, cutting through his confusion. In person," Theo repeated, baffled. "Why, what's going on?" She sighed, her posture softening, but the tension didn't leave her eyes. "It's complicated. I'm close by. Can I come aboard?" Theo's mind raced. He barely knew her, and yet she was asking to come aboard his ship. Appearing out of nowhere, the quiet, isolated life he carved out for himself was on the verge of being appended, and he couldn't shake the feeling that once he let her in, things would never be the same. "Yeah, sure," he said slowly, still trying to process what was happening. Docking bays open, the transmission cut out, and Theo set his coffee down, his heart beating faster. He didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, his sensors pinged, indicating a sleek, high-end vessel approaching. Definitely not the kind of ship that wandered into backwater systems Like this one, when the docking bay door slid open, Oriel stepped out dressed in a form-fitting flight suit, all practicality now, no trace of the gown she had worn on Talissa. Her green skin gleamed under the harsh lighting, but her eyes, those intense amber eyes, remained the same, full of secrets. Theo met her at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, skipping the pleasantries. There was no point. Something was clearly wrong. Oriel didn't waste time. Her voice was firm, steady, but not unkind. "I'm pregnant, Theo." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stared at her, unable to form a coherent thought. "Pregnant? You're what?" He finally managed, the shock evident in his voice. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her tone measured, as though she had prepared herself for this conversation long before she arrived. "And it's yours." Theo's world tilted, the universe flipping upside down. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was falling untethered through the reality she had just shattered. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. "That's not possible," he said, more to himself than to her. Oriel sighed, rubbing the back of her neck in a gesture that made her seem almost vulnerable. "I know it's hard to believe, but Verulian biology is adaptive. Our bodies can react quickly to the right genetic combinations. Even with other species, conception happens fast." Theo shook his head, trying to steady himself. "We were together one night on a resort, and now you're telling me this. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't true," Oriel said, her voice softening. "And more importantly, this pregnancy, it's not normal. There are complications." Theo's heart sank further. "What kind of complications?" Oriel's eyes darkened, her gaze flicking toward the ship's windows, where the vastness of space stretched out before them. "The Dran, they know, and they're hunting us. They see this child as an abomination." Theo clenched his fists, a cold dread settling over him. "They want to kill you. And the baby?" Oriel nodded, her voice a whisper. "Yes, and they won't stop." The weight of her words pressed down on him, heavier than any cargo he'd ever carried. This was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had ever faced. He wasn't just a cargo runner anymore. He was about to become a father, and they were about to become targets in a war neither of them could escape. Theo swallowed hard, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "What do we do?" Oriel met his gaze, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "We fight, Theo. We protect our child together." The glow of Tisa's twin moons filtered through the windows of the luxurious resort, casting long shadows across the room. The tranquil beauty of the place felt like a cruel irony as Oriel paced back and forth, her expression locked in silent turmoil. The sound of the gentle waves lapping at the bioluminescent shores outside was drowned by the weight of their situation. Theo leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her move. His mind was racing, trying to grasp the enormity of what they were about to face. The Dran were coming for them. "I still don't understand how they found us," Theo muttered, his frustration bubbling over. "You said Tisa was off-grid, that we'd be safe here." Oriel stopped pacing, her golden eyes flickering toward him. "It should have been, but the Dran have resources more than I thought. Their reach goes deeper into Verulian politics than I realized." Theo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure which was worse, the fact that they had been found, or the fact that they were now completely exposed. "So what do? We can't just sit here and wait for them to show up at our door." Oriel's gaze hardened. "We fight back, but not yet. Tisa's security systems are state-of-the-art. They'll buy us time, but it won't last." Theo glanced out the window at the peaceful beach below, feeling a gnawing unease. The resort was a fortress disguised as paradise, but every fortress had its weaknesses. His instincts screamed that they didn't have much time. "We need to leave now." "We can't," Oriel replied, her voice tight. "Not until I figure out who's leaking our location." "I thought I could trust the resort staff, but it's clear someone's working for the Dran. If we run now, they'll track us again wherever we go." Theo cursed under his breath, feeling trapped. The thought of being hunted, of the dare closing in on them, made his blood run cold. He wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. He was a runner, a man who thrived on slipping through the cracks, always staying one step ahead of danger. But now, with Oriel and the unborn child depending on him, the stakes were impossibly high. The stakes were personal. Oriel moved closer to him, her gaze Softening for just a moment. "I'm sorry, Theo. I never wanted to drag you into this." Theo met her eyes, feeling the weight of her apology settle over him. "We're in this together. Remember, no backing out now." For the first time since their desperate flight, a flicker of warmth passed between them. Oriel nodded, her lips curving into a small, grateful smile before the tension returned to her face. "I need you to trust me, Theo. I've dealt with the Drawn before. They won't stop. But they'll make mistakes. We have an advantage if we use it wisely." "And what advantage is that?" Theo asked, genuinely curious. Oriel's answer was immediate, and it caught him off guard. "They don't know you to them. You're just a human smuggler, a non-threat. But you know how to survive. You spent your life navigating dangerous situations, avoiding people who wanted you dead. That's exactly what we need right now." Theo raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. "So what, we use me as bait?" Oriel shook her head. "No, we use you to get us out of here when the time comes. But first we need to know exactly what we're up against." As if on key, the soft chime of the resort security alert system echoed through the room. Theo's heart skipped a beat, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered blaster. "They're here," Oriel whispered, her voice tight with dread. Theo's mind snapped into focus. "We need to move now." Oriel grabbed a small data pad from the table, her fingers flying across the screen as she pulled up the resort security feed. Theo watched over her shoulder as a series of sleek black ships descended toward the beach, their dark hulls shimmering under the moonlight. "Dran operatives," Oriel said, her tone grim. "They're moving fast." Theo felt the adrenaline spike through his veins. "Can the resort's defenses hold them off for a while?" Oriel replied, tapping into the system to activate the security drones. "But not forever. They'll breach soon." Theo's pulse quickened. It was one thing to run cargo through pirate-infested space, another to be hunted by an extremist faction bent on raising them. His mind raced through possible exits, escape routes, anything to keep them alive. Oriel turned to him, her expression determined but laced with fear. "We can't let them take us, Theo. If they get to the child, they won't." Theo cut in, his voice firm despite the gnawing dread inside him. "I won't let them." The two exchanged a brief loaded glance before Theo grabbed his blaster, moving toward the door. "We need to get to the docking bay. If we can get off this planet before they break through." "No," Oriel interrupted, her voice slow but resolute. "We stay, we fight. If we run now, they'll hunt us down. But if we hold them off here, we might just buy ourselves enough time to turn this around." Theo hesitated. The idea of staying felt like suicide, but he knew Oriel was right. Running now would only delay the inevitable. They had to fight. "All right," Theo said, gripping his blaster tighter. "Leighton, make sure they regret coming after us." The engines of Theo's star freighter roared to life as the ship rocketed away from Tessa, the burning remnants of the once pristine resort falling behind them. Through the viewport, Theo could still see the flickering lights of the security drones, fighting a losing battle against the Drawn soldiers swarming the beaches. A place that had promised peace had become a battleground, and now it was nothing but a fading memory. Oriel sat in the co-pilot seat, her eyes glued to the scanner, her face tight with tension. "We won't make it far if they pursue us," she said, her voice steady but laced with the weight of their narrow escape. "They won't track you," as Theo replied, flipping switches and inputting hyperspace coordinates. "We've got a lead for now, but we need more than a head start." He glanced at her. "You said you had contacts, people who could help us." Oriel nodded, her expression readable. "There's someone I trust, a Vuand defector. His name is Velcorin. He used to work deep within the DR's political arm before he abandoned them. If anyone can help us understand their movements, it's him." Theo narrowed his eyes. "You trust a defector with everything that's at stake?" "I don't have a choice," Oriel replied, her voice soft but firm. "We don't have a choice. V knows things no one else does. He's the reason I was able to evade them this long. Without him, we're flying blind." Theo leaned back in his seat, weighing her words. The thought of relying on someone with ties to the Drawn didn't sit well with him. But what other options did they have if this V really had inside information? It could make the difference between survival and annihilation. "Where is he?" "Not far. He's laying low on a small moon in the Thula system," Oriel said, her fingers dancing across the nav console as she entered the coordinates. "It's off the grid. We should be able to reach him without drawing attention, Theo punched in the new course, watching as the stars stretched into long streaks of light, the ship slipping into hyperspace. For a moment the roar of the engines dulled into a low hum, and silence settled between them, but the quiet only amplified the weight of what had happened and what was still coming as the ship hurtled through space. Theo couldn't stop his thoughts from spiraling. He kept seeing the dark, armored data soldiers storming the resort. Relentless, merciless, determined to erase them from existence. He thought about Oriole standing PA, despite the fear in her eyes, fighting against the inevitable. And then he thought about the child, their child, still growing inside her. Symbol of everything the Dran feared. The enormity of it hit him again. He wasn't just running cargo anymore. He was running from an entire faction, bent on extermination. And the life he was fighting to protect wasn't just his own. I still don't understand why this child matters so much to them, Theo muttered, his voice breaking the silence. It's just a baby. What do they think it's going to do? Oriole's gaze shifted toward him, her amber eyes filled with a sadness he hadn't seen before. It's not just about the child, Theo. It's about what the child represents: a merging of species, a breaking of the old ways. The Dihar believe in purity, in keeping virulent bloodlines untouched. To them, this child is a threat to everything they stand for, so they kill to preserve their traditions. Theo's voice hardened, his frustration rising. That's insane fanaticism. Always is, Oriole replied quietly, but it runs deep. The deer have been growing in power for years, feeding on fear and division. And now, with this child, they found their rallying point. They won't stop until we're erased. Theo exhaled sharply, gripping the controls tighter. Then we need to stop them first. We will, Oriole said, her tone full of quiet determination. That's why we need V. He knows their weaknesses, their blind spots. He can help us fight back. The ship shuddered as it exited hyperspace, the starfield snapping back into focus ahead. The pale glow of Tala's moon came into view, a barren rock orbiting a distant dying sun. There was no civilization here. No sign of life, only the jagged surface of the moon stretching out beneath them, its craters casting long shadows in the faint light. Theo brought the ship down smoothly, landing near the mouth of a cave that cut deep into the moon's surface. The place was as desolate as it looked, perfect for someone trying to disappear. Are you sure he's here? Theo asked, powering down the engines. Oriole nodded. Vel doesn't trust easily, but he won't leave us hanging. He knows what's at stake. Theo grabbed his blaster and stood, his instincts sharp, his body tense. He didn't like walking into unknown situations, especially not when the stakes were this high, but they were in too deep to turn back now. They exited the ship, the cold, thin air biting at Theo's skin as they approached the cave. The silence was oppressive, the only sound their footsteps crunching against the rocky ground inside the cave. It was dark, save for the faint glow of emergency lighting that flickered along the walls. As they ventured deeper, Theo's pulse quickened. He could feel eyes on them, the tension of being watched from the shadows. His hand hovered near his blaster, ready for anything. And then from the darkness, a figure emerged. Vorin was tall, his silver hair falling in sharp lines around his face, his Vuan features marked by a severity that spoke of hard choices and harder years. His golden eyes locked onto Theo first, then flicked to Oriole. There was no warmth in his expression, only the cold calcul of someone who had lived too long in the shadows. You brought company, Dee said, his voice low. And even I brought someone we can trust, Oriole replied, her tone steady. We don't have time for games, V. The deer are coming for us. We need your help. V's eyes lingered on Theo for a long moment before he finally nodded, stepping aside to let them deeper into the cave. Then you better come inside. We have much to discuss. As they followed Val into the darkness, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Alleys in the shadows, yes, but shadows were where monsters lived too. The quiet hum of the starship was the only sound in the cockpit as Theo and Oriole stared at the dark expanse ahead. In the distance, a planet loomed, shrouded in swirling clouds and shadow. Vosa, the heart of the Dr's power. It was a world buried in darkness, its surface barely visible from orbit, as if the very light of the stars refused to touch it. It felt like a graveyard, And in any ways, that's exactly what it was. Theo tightened his grip on the controls, his gaze locked on the ominous planet. "We really doing this?" he muttered, his voice low and tense. Oriel, sitting beside him, didn't answer. Immediately her amber eyes were focused hard, the usual warmth gone. "We have no choice. V gave us the intel. If we hit them here, we ___. Their ability to mobilize this is where the DR core operations are buried. If we don't stop them now, we never will." Theo exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the mission settle over him. They had planned for this, gathered every piece of intelligence they could, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the planet itself. Fosso was more than just a stronghold. It was a fortress of fear, a place where enemies vanished without a trace. "Look, I know we have to do this," Theo said, his voice taut with nerves, "but we're going in with a handful of weapons and a target on our backs. This place, it feels like a trap." Oriel turned to him, her gaze softening for just a moment. "It's always been a trap, Theo, but we're not walking into it blindly. We have Vel's intel. We know where their communication hubs are, how to disrupt their networks. If we can take out their infrastructure, we ___ their reach, yeah, and we make it out alive." How? Theo's jaw clenched as he ran a hand through his hair. He'd faced impossible odds before, but nothing quite like this. The Dran weren't just soldiers, they were fanatics, and they were ruthless. "We make it out because we have to," Oriel said, her voice steady. "There's no option." Theo studied her face, seeing the fear she tried to hide beneath the surface. This wasn't just about the mission or even about survival. It was about the future, their future, and the future of the child she carried. The Dran wanted to erase that future, to wipe them from existence, but Oriel wasn't going to let them. And neither was he. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right, we do this your way, but if anything goes sideways, we adapt." Oriel finished for him, her lips curving into a small, determined smile. "Just like we always do." Theo didn't respond, but a flicker of admiration sparked in him. Oriel had faced down the Drawn her entire life, fought through the shadows of her own people's politics, and now she was leading them straight into the heart of their enemy's domain. Without a second of hesitation, her courage was contagious, and Theo found himself latching onto it as they descended toward Vosa. The ship broke through the planet's atmosphere, the darkness swallowing them whole. A dense, oppressive fog blanketed the landscape, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Theo's sensors pinged softly, scanning for signs of life, but everything was eerily quiet, too quiet. "We're near the perimeter of their main complex," Oriel said, her eyes flicking to the scanner. "V's information said they have a hidden entrance on the southern side. We get in, plant the disruptors, and get out before they realize we're here." Theo nodded, his fingers tapping against the controls. "Simple plan. Let's hope it stays that way." They set the ship down in a barren rock valley, well outside the range of any detection towers. Theo grabbed his blaster and the small pack of disruptors. They brought his mind slipping into the sharp focus that always came before a job. But this wasn't just any job, this was war. Oriel led the way through the fog, her movements swift and precise. The terrain was rough, the air heavy with moisture, but they moved silently, staying low and out of sight. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the planet's silence pressing down on them. It was as if the very ground was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable violence that would follow. After what felt like hours, they reached the southern wall of the DR complex, a towering black structure that seemed to rise out of the fog like a monolith. It was fortified, heavily guarded, but just as V had promised, there was a hidden service entrance built into the rock. Oriel crouched beside the entrance, pulling out a small device and connecting it to the lock. "This should bypass the security," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Theo knelt beside her, his blaster in hand, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. His heart pounded in his chest, the tension mounting with each passing second. If this didn't work, if they were discovered now. The door clicked open with a soft hiss, and Oriel shot him a quick glance. "We're in." They slipped inside the narrow corridor, dimly lit and cold. The complex was massive, a labyrinth of tunnels and rooms, But Vel had provided them with a map of the facility's layout. Their target was the communications hub deep within the central structure. If they could disable it, the Dr's coordination would be crippled, buying them precious time. As they moved deeper into the heart of the complex, Theo's nerves sharpened. Every corner, every shadow felt like a threat, waiting to spring. The Dran were close, and though they hadn't encountered resistance, yet he knew it was only a matter of time before the silence broke. Suddenly, Oriole froze, holding up a hand. Theo tensed, following her gaze down the hall. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoed through the corridor. A head growing louder with each second. Theo's pulse quickened as he pressed himself against the wall of his blaster. Ready, Oriole crouched beside him, her eyes narrowing. As the sound approached, the hunt was about to begin. The soft hum of the ship's engines was a welcome contrast to the chaos. They'd barely escaped. Theo sat slumped in the pilot's seat, staring out at the vast, empty stretch of space before them. His hands still trembled, adrenaline coursing through his veins from the fight that had nearly cost them everything. They had made it out of Vosa alive, but only just in the co-pilot seat. Oriole was silent, her amber eyes unfocused as she stared at the navigation console. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, her posture tense. She hadn't spoken much since they left the Dran stronghold behind, the weight of the mission hanging over her like a storm cloud. Theo could feel the unspoken questions between them, the uncertainty, the fear, and the impossible stakes they now faced. He didn't need to ask to know what she was thinking. He was thinking it too. "How's the kid?" Theo's voice broke the silence, his tone softer than usual. He wasn't used to asking about things like this, but the child was no longer just an abstract concept. It was real, this child growing inside her, a symbol of everything the Dar feared. And now it was their responsibility. Oriole blinked, her gaze shifting from the console to her hands, which rested protectively over her stomach. She looked exhausted, her features pale and strained, the toll of the battle etched into every line of her face. "Stable for now," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, but the stress, the risk. She trailed off, biting her lip, as though she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Theo nodded, a heavy lump settling in his chest. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to talk about something like this. His life had always been about survival, about staying one step ahead of danger. But this fatherhood responsibility for a life that wasn't his own, this was a different kind of fear, and it terrified him. "We can't keep running forever," Theo said, more to himself than to her. His gaze drifted out into the stars again, their cold light doing nothing to calm the storm raging in his mind. "The Dran, they'll keep coming. No matter where we go, they'll keep hunting us. I know." Oriole's voice was steady, but he could hear the cracks beneath the surface. "But we've slowed them down. The hit on Vosa crippled their operations, at least for now. It gives us time to figure out what to do next." Theo let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Time? How much time until the next attack? Until they track us down again? Every second we stay alive, they're regrouping, getting ready for another strike." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, running his hands through his hair. "I'm not sure how long we can keep doing this, Oriole. You're pregnant, you need to rest." And he stopped himself, not sure what to say next. Oriole turned to him, her eyes softening. "We figure it out, Theo. We don't have all the answers yet, but we'll find them." The calm in her voice was almost enough to soothe the panic rising in his chest. Almost, but not quite. He straightened up, the weight of the situation pulling him down again. "You've been fighting them your whole life," he said, his voice low. This child, it's not just about survival anymore, is it?" Oriole's gaze darkened, her eyes reflecting the cold expanse of space outside the ship. "No, it's about more than that." She paused, her hands still resting protectively over her stomach. "The Dara see this child as a threat because it represents something they fear: change, evolution, a breaking of the old ways." Theo frowned, trying to make sense of it all. "But why does it matter so much to them? Why risk everything to stop one child?" Oriole's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because this child, our child, represents the future, a future where the old divisions between species no longer matter, where humans and Verulian and others can coexist, can be more than the limits of their bloodlines. The Dran want to preserve purity. They see this as contamination." Her voice grew quieter, more somber. "But they can't stop what's coming. No one can." Theo let her words sink in the enormity of it washing over him. He wasn't just protecting Oriel anymore. He wasn't just running from the deer. He was standing in the way of an entire ideology, one that had been entrenched for generations, one that would do anything to stop the future from happening. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him harder than any blast or fire ever could. This child, it's more than just ours, isn't it? Theo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the key to something bigger. Oriel looked at him, her amber eyes filled with a deep, quiet intensity. Yes, she said softly. It is. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a bond that had formed between them in the shadows of fear and danger. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. The Dran won't stop, Oriel said, her voice resolute, but neither will we. We'll fight them. We'll protect our child, Theo. We'll protect the future. Theo nodded, his heart still pounding but steadier now, more certain. Yeah, he said, his voice firm. We will, for the first time since they left Vosa. Theo felt a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but real. The fight was far from over, but for the first time it didn't feel hopeless. They had something to fight for now, something worth risking. Everything, for the stars stretched endlessly before them, and though the darkness still loomed large, Theo knew they would face it together. No matter what came next, they would fight, and they would survive for the child, for the future. The black expanse of space stretched out endlessly before them, a sea of stars glittering like distant promises. Theo sat in the pilot's seat, staring out into the void, his thoughts spinning as the silence of the cockpit pressed down on him. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, but the tension in the air was anything but. It was the calm before the storm, and both he and Oriel knew it. This would be their final stand. Oriel sat beside him, her posture rigid, but her expression calm. A quiet determination settled into the lines of her face. She barely spoken. Since F's transmission had come through the warning clear, the Dran were mobilizing for one last strike. They had been found again, hunted their movements, tracked. The Dran knew where they were headed, and this time they weren't going to let them slip away. They're going to throw everything they have at us, Theo said, his voice low, breaking the stillness. They won't stop until we're dead, or worse. Oriel nodded, her eyes fixed on the stars. We knew this was coming, she replied softly. We've crippled their operations, but they're not defeated, not yet. Theo exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I'm not sure how many more miracles we can pull off, Oriel. We've been lucky, but luck runs out. Oriel turned to him, her golden eyes steady, fierce. It's not about luck anymore. It's about fighting for what matters, for the child, for the future. Her voice was unwavering, but beneath the calm, Theo could hear the edge of fear. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of failing, of losing everything they had fought for. Theo looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he truly understood the weight she carried. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far bigger than either of them. The child she carried, their child, was the hope for a new beginning, the symbol of a future that the Dran feared. But it was more than that. It was about standing up to a force that had terrorized the galaxy for far too long, a force that believed in division, purity, and the erasure of anything that didn't fit their narrow, brutal vision of the world. They were fighting for something larger than themselves, for a future where species could coexist, where boundaries didn't define who you could be or what you could become. We can't keep running, Theo said, his voice firmer now, the weight of his decision settling into his bones. Not anymore. It's time we take the fight to them. Oriel turned, surprise flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? I mean we stop waiting for them to catch up to us, Theo said, his jaw tightening. We make our stand here now. Oriel's eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she was silent, weighing his words, the gravity of what he was suggesting. Then she nodded, a small, resolute movement. You're right. We can outrun them forever. But if we fight, we do it on our terms. Theo felt a surge of relief at her agreement, though it was quickly swallowed by the cold reality of what they were about to face. We don't have much time, he said, his mind already racing through the logistics. We need to find a place somewhere defensible, somewhere we can hold them off, or else. Fingers moved across the console, pulling up a map of nearby systems. Her eyes scanned the data quickly, her mind as sharp as ever despite the fatigue pulling at her. "There's a small asteroid belt not far from here," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's mostly uncharted, but it has pockets where we can hide, set up traps, and force them to come to us." Theo glanced at the map, nodding that work. "They'll expect us to keep running. They won't be ready for an ambush." For the first time in what felt like days, a glimmer of hope flickered in Oral's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had a plan. It was dangerous, reckless, even, but it was the best shot they had. As Theo adjusted their course, Oriel leaned back in her seat, her hand resting on her stomach. Her expression softened for a moment, a quiet, unspoken bond between them, as they both thought about the child, the fragile life that had brought them together, that had changed everything. "I never thought my life would leave me here," Theo said, quietly, his eyes on the stars. "I never thought I'd be fighting for something like this." Oriel smiled, a soft, tired smile. "Neither did I, but sometimes the universe has other plans." Theo chuckled, the sound hollow but sincere. "Yeah, well, the universe sure knows how to make things complicated." Oriel reached over, her hand brushing his lightly. "We'll make it through this, Theo. We have to." Theo turned to her, his heart tightening at the sight of her strong, determined, but so much more fragile than she'd ever let on. He squeezed her hand gently. "We will, together." The ship rumbled as it entered the asteroid field, the stars shifting as they navigated through the jagged rocks.